Welcome to part 4 of Film Chats, conversations with Ottawa's film, TV, and media community, presented by Digi60 Filmmakers Festival. I'm Samphe Balamingi, a student of sociology at Carleton University and an emerging filmmaker. Over the past few months, I've sat down with some fabulous professionals here in Ottawa to talk about issues of representation in the film industry. Today I'm chatting with Barbara Balfour and Hoda Elatawi at the Vision 2020 Women in Film and Media panel. Barbara is a TV host and producer, award-winning public speaker, and international print journalist. In addition to hosting a live talk show in Ottawa, Barbara writes regularly for the BBC, Globe and Mail, and every major daily newspaper in Canada. Hoda is the senior producer and VP of GAPC Entertainment and has created award-winning content for over 2 decades. In the coming year, she is directing a feature-length film, So You Want to Be a Muslim, for CBC's documentary channel. Thank you everyone so much for joining us today. It's lovely to see such a wonderful turnout on International Women's Day. I guess I'll just get into the questions for our wonderful panelists. This panel is centered around representation in the film and media industry. However, women's share of writing, directing, and cinematography in both film and television remains below 25%, with less than 2% of contracts going to women who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I'm wondering, drawing on your own experiences in the industry, have you observed this unequal representation? And has there been any progress towards more diverse representation?
So I've been in the industry probably some 25 years or more. For sure, when I first started in the industry, I think there was a lot less representation in terms of the different kinds of roles that we saw women in. I have seen a change. Working in the last few years in television, we've seen a lot of changes with our funding agencies where part of the eligibility criteria is having gender parity. And so that is something that is forcing producers and production companies to look at their teams and look at mentoring more women in the industry. In Ottawa, what's great is Ottawa, I feel, is a continuously growing industry, and we're seeing more and more emerging talent. Perhaps it's not as easy in Ottawa as it might be in Toronto, but I think as a company and as a producer, we've been making a very concerted effort, and we are seeing, I mean, from my experience, I would say the majority of people that I work with on my teams are women. So absolutely the change is coming. Are we there yet? No, not yet.
I started my career 20 years ago in the daily newsroom of a newspaper called the Calgary Herald in Calgary, Alberta, which was not exactly known as a bastion of diversity and equality in those days. I would say that starting my career in the newsroom, there were plenty of women working at the paper, but they were really delegated to certain sections. So you saw a lot of women in the lifestyle section, in entertainment, for instance, or in food and travel. You saw more men in business, sports, golf, auto coverage, and I'm certainly observing the same to be true even now, even as our industry has evolved into one that's more dominated by freelancers and contractors as opposed to one person working a full-time job for one media outlet. I'm still seeing a lack of representation of women covering the automobile sector, technology, and other topics that were sort of traditionally dominated by men and still seem to continue to do so. I've worked at Rogers Television as a host and producer for the last 4 years, and Rogers TV is really a community channel, and so I would say they're much more prone to diversity and representation than perhaps larger stations. I certainly have seen lots of progress on that front compared to when I started 2 decades ago, but like Hoda said, I don't think we're quite where we should be in 2020.
Can I just add one other thing? In my world, I feel that we're seeing a fair amount of producers who are women. I'm working with a number of women who are writing. Where I feel we're really lacking is women in the technical fields, so cinematographers, people who are doing audio work, editors. I feel that support is not there, and that's something I'd really love to see built up, and it's something that I've talked to about our funders. It's really great to ask for gender parity on our teams, but the focus on gender parity with our funders is on writers and producers and directors, and I think we need to move that more into some of the technical fields as well.
Our crew should also have greater representation and diversity, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Amazing. And when we elevate these previously silenced voices, we bring to the fore a broader range of stories and perspectives. I'm wondering, how do we ensure that these stories are being told? How do we ensure that these stories are being told, that stories are told by women?
Well, I think, like we said, we've got a ways to go. But I do feel that there is, again, and at least I can only really speak from the world that I work in, there is a real focus, and it's wonderful to see on emerging talent. There is a focus on seeing stories being told by diverse storytellers and women storytellers. So it's there, it's starting. I think the infrastructures need to be strengthened, the training needs to be built up to allow pathways and accessibility for those stories to be told.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add, Barbara?
Yeah, I think that it's important to continue hiring storytellers who are from diverse backgrounds, more women and people from all parts of the world, because they have intimate access to communities. They can tell stories that the rest of us know nothing about. Any editor that I've worked with in any medium, be it audio, video, or print, has always been open to that untold story. They're always looking for stories that have not been covered by other outlets. So I think the appetite for that coverage is certainly there. It's just a question of execution and I guess having the skills as a journalist to ask the right questions and know who to talk to, who to bring into your project. But I mean, I've certainly seen organizations like CBC have wonderful programs for documentaries. For instance, they really invite submissions from people from the general public to come up with ideas and propose novel programs that we haven't seen before.
That sounds like it's making it a lot more accessible too, by kind of asking the public to bring forth their ideas. In that vein, how can gatekeepers create better support for these marginalized voices, or are they already creating better supports?
Again, like from the production industry, the independent production industry, I think that those programs have or are in place or coming into place. I believe that the infrastructures still need to be strengthened. We're seeing, has anybody seen Transplant on CTV? So Hamza Haq, who I think is Pakistani origin, is playing a Syrian refugee, come to Toronto, I believe, and is working as a doctor in the hospital. And what's really great about that show is it's giving voice to a lot of these diversity things that we're talking about. It's giving us a lens into worlds that where we may have misconceptions already. So it's addressing and challenging some of the stereotypes. What was great about what Hamza said in one of the articles that I read, who's actually an Ottawa boy, by the way, was that he really felt that this program is about 5 years too late. We should have been doing this kind of programming much sooner. And it would be really nice to see, women in those roles as well. So, it could have been a female refugee from Syria who's playing that role. So we're getting there. Again, I will reiterate that the funding organizations that we work with are intent on providing some, equity in terms of roles and diversity. It's just, I'm not sure how to push those gatekeepers to open those doors wider and to make it more accessible. So as producers, when we're looking for diverse talent and emerging talent, how do we find them? How do we find the ways to support mentoring them to get them to where they need to be so that they can, provide and bring the great stories that they have to tell?
Amazing. I didn't even know he was an Ottawa boy too. That's wonderful. Yeah. Barbara?
I have to add that when it comes to media and the consumption of information, that the industry has changed so dramatically, even in the last 10 years, in terms of how easy technology has made it for us to be able to take a photo for a magazine cover, to start our own podcast, even to take high definition video. And the fact that most people are freelancers, I think has really opened it up. I mean, there really is such a thing as a citizen journalist. If you're a person who believes that you have a story to tell, you have a lot more avenues to tell that story and to team up with other people than you ever have before.
If I could just also add, that I think that, just jumping on what you said, that people have the opportunity to tell stories because of the different platforms and the accessibility of different platforms. And I think, Maisa's a really good example. I mean, she had a vision and a passion to do this series, and she went ahead and she did it, and she probably, played a lot of different roles. And I think that's what's also great is women they're writing, they're directing, they're shooting, they're editing, they're doing all these things because they have the tools, the ability, and to get them online and to build an audience for it. And and when people take those risks and are passionate about telling their stories, those stories may find bigger audiences, bigger communities. And one of the things I'll just say as an aside, that's kind of how I met Maisa. I mean, I met her through a couple of events like this, but I also saw her work. And I'm just astounded by the energy and the passion that she has for telling stories from a particular perspective, a very diverse perspective. And so now we're actually in conversation about looking at how we can work together to bring another series that she's passionate about to more screens. So I think the opportunities are there, just like what you were saying, citizen journalism. Like, we can tell our own stories, we have our own voices, and it's about telling those stories, putting them on a platform and finding community and audience. That's another way, for sure.
Just to add to that, I think we're extremely fortunate to have one of the last few remaining community television stations in the country. So, for instance, someone like myself was able to come in. I started behind the camera. I started filming a different show, and then I sort of worked my way up. And then when the auditions came up for Ottawa Experts, which I've been hosting and producing for 4 years now, I sort of had an in, and I already knew the people I'd be working with. And so now I can say I have my own show, and I really have unlimited ability to bring in any guest I want, to talk about whatever I want. I mean, the only restriction is that it's a family show, so we have to keep it PG-13. But I'm definitely mindful of addressing a diverse range of topics and bringing in guests from all over the place to lend their unique perspectives.
Amazing. It's really inspiring to think that journalism and filmmaking has just become so much more accessible over the years. In terms of stepping into your roles as directors, as producers, as journalists, I'm wondering how your identity has impacted the way you step into that role, and if it has impacted the way you step into your roles, how so? Either one of you.
I'm going to get you just to repeat that.
Of course.
I'm suffering from a bit of a cold and my
No
ears are
worries.
blocked. So
I'm wondering how your identity has affected the way that you've stepped into your roles as producers, as directors, as journalists, and if so, how?
Please start.
Sure. I think it's had a huge role for me, not just as a woman, but also as a first-generation Canadian. I have the kind of name that I think makes most people expect a 60-year-old white British woman to show up. But my family actually immigrated from the former Soviet Union in the 1980s as political refugees. And it was really tough, and I really experienced the pain of being an immigrant through them and through having to straddle two different cultures and the expectations of each one. Definitely poverty and feeling like an outsider was part of it as well. It was part of my life experience. And now looking back, I can say that feeling like an outsider can be a tremendous gift when you're a storyteller. It gives you empathy, it gives you compassion, it gives you the ability to see behind or beneath the mask. And I'm definitely much more passionate about telling stories about immigrants and immigrant journeys than if I hadn't had the experience that I had growing up here.
Agree with everything you said. Also, as a first generation immigrant growing up in Canada and being one of a very few handful of brown people or people of color in the schools that I went to. It wasn't really until university that I experienced sort of a greater diversity. Really did kind of, you're right, like strengthen that idea of having empathy and trying to understand other people as you wish that people would have empathy and try to understand you. When I also graduated from journalism a long time ago. I'll just say like over 30 years ago. And the thesis that I did, interestingly enough, which I think is what put me on the path to where I am now, is I was very, very curious about male and female broadcast journalists on television and how their roles differed, how their jobs differed. And so my partner and I decided, instead of writing a paper each to graduate, we were going to make a film. We applied to and received $10,000 from I think it was multiculturalism or one of those departments, and which was a huge amount at that time. And we made a film that explored how women's jobs on camera differed from men's. And of course, I mean, it painted such a clear picture in terms of if you're a female journalist, audience response was usually centered around whether or not you changed your hairdo or got an outfit that they didn't like. And for men, it was very often based around the stories that they told. We even interviewed one journalist who was a radio journalist at the time and working in a small rural town, and the farmers complained that her voice bothered their cows because it was a female voice. So that, I think, also helped sort of form part of my identity in terms of the kinds of subjects that I was interested in pursuing in terms of social issues. For me, identity is a big one, and I think personally and professionally, those are the kinds of films that I explore. It's an ongoing journey, and so for me, I think it's opened up or informed how I approach projects, both on the documentary and even on the children's side. We're very committed to making sure that we have as best representation that we can on our shows, even our children's shows, that reflect the audience that's watching, where audiences can see themselves reflected. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but.
Absolutely. And on this thread of what projects you choose to explore, I'm wondering if there are any stories that you want to tell but you're hesitant to do so. And if the specifics are difficult to share, I'm wondering if you could maybe share the context of why it's challenging to tell certain stories.
So I'm working on a film right now called So You Want to Be a Muslim. And it's a feature-length documentary for, as Emily said, the CBC's Doc Channel. I started researching it probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and finally just got the green light a couple of months ago, yay. And I'm following 3 women who have converted to Islam, and the film really challenges the stereotypes around people who convert to Islam in the West. So when we hear often, and it's often through the media and or politicians, when we hear about people who convert to Islam in the West, particularly Caucasian people, I think sometimes alarm bells go off. Oh my God, are they going to become radicals? Are they going to become terrorists? If they're women, are they going to be oppressed? And so I'm following 3 very diverse women who have converted to Islam and following their stories. One of the challenges that I'm finding, and as a filmmaker, I'm trying to figure out how to navigate, is when you are putting people under a spotlight and they're letting you into their life, how do you ensure that you don't betray their trust, tell a story in a way that puts them at risk, and at the same time tell a story that's engaging, because you want to build drama, you want to have those moments of tension, and so you want to be true to your vision as a filmmaker and how you want to tell the story, and at the same time make sure that you're not putting your characters at risk. So that's one of the things that I struggle with.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hoda.
I'm working on a documentary right now that I filmed a year ago in the country of Georgia, and what started out as what was supposed to be just a lighthearted take on food and the wine in Georgia turned into something a bit more serious when our tour guide took us to a refugee settlement just outside of the capital city of Tbilisi, where we met and actually broke bread with some of the refugees, the victims of Russia's illegal occupation of 20% of Georgia, which happened 10 years ago, and it's still ongoing. And just sort of seeing the heartbreak and the vulnerability, like you mentioned, Hoda, you become really cognizant of not wanting to manipulate the audience, not wanting to take advantage of the people who are on the other side of the camera, not wanting to put them in a situation that could put their lives at peril if this documentary were to come out. And so, and it's also very difficult not to become emotionally involved with your subjects. It's very difficult to remain detached from the story, and especially as a woman, if you're coming in with empathy and compassion and sort of putting yourself in their shoes, it's very difficult to know how lightly you should tread and still remain true to the story.
I think there's a difference between being, personally, a filmmaker that is approaching a subject or subjects with empathy and an open mind and really wanting to get into their stories versus doing a survey piece or a journalistic piece where you're really trying to find that balance, that objectivity. And I'm a fairly new filmmaker. I'm a pretty seasoned producer, but this is only my second film that I'm directing. I cannot do it without becoming emotionally invested in the stories of my characters and really living with them to a certain degree in order to be able to capture the authenticity of their stories. So it's like I think that you can't be objective, I feel, as a filmmaker who's telling something with a point of view.
Both of these sound like such amazing projects and films. I'm wondering how you came to uncover these projects, how you decided on these projects, and how you decide which stories to tell in general.
So for me, this new film really sort of came out of my first film that I directed, Minisa in the Middle, which was a film about identity as it related to second-generation Muslims and navigating intersecting identities. And that's something that probably a lot of people can relate to, and particularly people who are first and second-generation immigrants can relate to. So during the course of that first film, I met somebody who was a convert, and it kind of opened my eyes to some of the stereotypes that existed around that, and that kind of set me on the path. And it took me probably a good 3 years and a lot of interviews and pre-interviews to find those three main outstanding characters. I'll just give you an example. Like, one of my main characters at 57 years old became the first female Muslim chaplain in the Canadian Armed Forces, which is huge. I mean, she's this lovely, wonderful Caucasian woman who converted over 20 years ago. She married a Muslim man. She's now divorced that man, but she has transformed her life and decided that she wants to sort of take back her agency, and she's gotten this job, and she's starting that job. It's at ground zero. Like, this is the first time in the forces, in Canada's armed forces, that we have a Canadian female Muslim chaplain. So that's one example of it. So you have to look, you have to research, talk to a lot of different people, listen to people's stories, and in having people share their stories, I always feel as a filmmaker it's important to share your story with them, because then it becomes a conversation. And I think it's building that bond and that trust is by sharing your stories, it's a way to get there.
I made the decision to move from print journalism to audio and video forms of storytelling within the last 5 or 10 years, as I realized that the price of information is essentially going down and people aren't subscribing to magazines and newspapers anymore. So I really wanted to expand my repertoire of being able to tell great stories. Now, again, when I started in journalism, there was a very distinct line between journalism and PR, and people in PR were kind of the enemy. Now it's a very different story, especially when it comes to funding things like international trips. So now journalists don't have that ability like they once used to ask the media outlet to cover their expenses or pay for their trips. So they tend to rely on public relations agencies or government ministries of tourism and so on. So I would not have been able to film this documentary were I not hosted by Georgia's Ministry of Tourism, and I actually just lucked out. I happened to meet the ambassador to Georgia at a social function we took to chatting, and they're really interested in increasing people's awareness of both the country and also the political situation of what's going on. So he offered to host me and paid for me and one cameraman to go there, and we also had a guide. We had a fixer and a chauffeur, and it was a very small crew. But again, thanks to the evolution of technology, when you look at the footage, you can't really tell how sort of strapped for resources we were. So Georgia had been on my bucket list for a long time, just because it's one of those countries that you don't really hear very much about, and there is such an appetite for authenticity, especially in this era of globalization. I mean, everyone's been to London and Paris and Rome and New York, and everyone's always sort of hungry, what's the next new thing, what's the undiscovered country, what's the new trend that no one's ever heard of. And what also captivated me about Georgia, on top of it being sort of off the beaten path, was the fact that it's a country that's really struggling for an identity. It has been conquered by numerous nations over hundreds of years, and yet they are so proud and fiercely independent and nationalistic, and they've managed to conserve their own language and their own alphabet. I think there's a lot of wonderful things to be told about this country and their history. So that's certainly what captivated me. And the only thing that's really holding me back is just financial resources, really.
It sounds like networking, both in finding your characters and meeting the people who you want to follow, but also finding people who will open those doors for you and fund your projects, has been incredibly important. In terms of kind of like a little bit of a pivot, but in this industry, I'd imagine that you're constantly hustling and you have to navigate sustaining yourself long term without burning out. I'm wondering, when should you say yes to projects and when should you say no? And is it okay to say no to projects? I realize that's a bit of a leading question.
Yeah, we had a little bit of a conversation about that on the phone when you called me, and I was just talking with friends about that very thing here. As an independent production company or an independent producer or journalist, it is really hard to say no to projects because you are working to survive from one project to the other, and in between you're developing your passion projects. So, you know, often we'll get in the door a project where we'll, with a broadcaster who says, you know, here's what I want, and here's the money that I have for it, and, you know, I'll look to my colleagues or in this instance, Ken, my executive producer at GAPC, and I'll say, can we really do it? And he's like, I think we have to. And if we get enough of those through the door, so maybe there's going to be some economies of scale. You're right, like it is a constant challenge, and I don't really have an answer to find, to say how you find that balance between not burning out. Really, if you can surround yourself by really good colleagues that where you can collaborate well, that is a privilege to be able to have, and that's one way of avoiding burnout. But networking and taking on projects is just part of the gig, and it's really the only way that you can get, I think, from moving from one project to the other. And then, you know, in your own life, finding some kind of work-life balance, you know, some time for self-care, little bits of time.
Little pockets for yourself.
Little tiny pockets of time.
It's really, really tough. I'm not going to lie. When you're not working, you're hustling for work. It's a feast or famine industry. And I think, you know, part of it is because any creative industry is seen as a vitamin, not a painkiller. And so your work and your self-worth is always being negotiated. You're negotiating your worth every single day. And, you know, there are days where I get a little bit resentful. I mean, you would never try to negotiate a better price for open heart surgery, right? You wouldn't try to negotiate over the cost of a bridge. And, you know, I think that's part and parcel of being in an industry that isn't necessarily regulated, that is so open to new entrants because of the nature and the accessibility and how much it's evolved. You know, I think as I get older and as I get more experience, I've become better at saying no and turning down projects. The only times that your self-worth becomes negotiable, I think, is when you need some fast cash or you need to pay the rent. But if you can practice financial literacy and you can try to save up in those months where it's feasting time, then you find that you won't have to compromise yourself for projects that you know you deserve better and you could certainly command a better rate. It's tough, and I say to women, especially to women, because we've been conditioned since we were children to be modest and not be greedy and be humble and, you know, put the needs of others in front of ourselves. Negotiate everything. Everything is negotiable. You know, your salary, how much you're going to be paid for the project. And I would caution you to be careful about not taking on too many projects where you're not being paid what your value is, because as human beings, we're extremely adaptable. It's amazing what we will accept as normal if we're doing it too much, too often, too long.
If I could just add to that, in our world, we spend a lot of time, and probably yours as well, where you're putting in a lot of free time developing projects. And so, to your point, be really clear on what you're passionate about, because when you're putting in development time, that's your sweat equity, that's your blood, sweat, and tears. So make sure that you absolutely love it, because it's also that passion that's going to help sell it. If you're not passionate about it, don't do it. For the projects where, you know, the budgets are small, where it gets really hard for us as a production company is we feel really passionate about the idea, so we're going to do it because we love the idea. So sometimes, yes, the dollars and cents don't make as much sense as you want them to, but I think part of being in this industry is you have to love storytelling, you have to be able to get passionate about ideas, you have to love people, you have to be okay with networking, you have to be okay with putting yourself out there and showing the passion that you have for the ideas that really kind of turn your crank. That's just sort of part and parcel of the package that I think that you have to be if you want to work in the creative industries.
That's absolutely crucial. You have to love what you do to be in this job. You definitely don't enter it for the money, for sure. I think it's also important for women to ask for what they want, whatever it is on a project, whether it's financial or otherwise. Because if you don't ask for what you want, no one is going to give it to you. And if you don't respect your own value as a producer, as a journalist, as a professional, no one else will. I was struck by the difference the other day, the differences between children and adults when it comes to negotiation. And if any of you have children, you'll really appreciate this. If a toddler asks you for a cookie and the answer is no, how does the toddler respond? Please. Like for the child, the word no is the start of the conversation, whereas we as adults, we tend to shut down. And so I really stress this in the creative industries, perhaps more than any other industry. It's so important to be clear on what your expectations are. Know what your slam dunk offer is and your basement offer is. So for instance, like your slam dunk offer is the offer that you'll definitely say yes to, no questions asked, and your basement offer is the bare minimum you're willing to accept to still be able to make a living. And so everything in between your slam dunk offer and your basement offer is negotiable.
And on this thread, I'm wondering if you have any tips for women creatives, either emerging or established, in terms of professional development. So as you mentioned, Barbara, in terms of negotiating salary, but also finding allies and collaborators, taking risks, etc.
I think it's really important to align yourself with people that can help mentor you through a process or a project. If you're looking to gain more experience, don't be shy about going to a producer or a company to say, I have this idea, or I want to know more about writing or editing, can I shadow? Producers are often very open to that. So take advantage of that, because it also is the beginning of your networking. It's a way for you to start getting to know other people in the business, and that's how you also open doors, particularly if you're emerging. So align yourself with people that have experience or who are doing work that you like, or if you have an idea that you're very passionate about, find somebody that you feel could embrace that passion and help mentor you through that process. It may not end up, the project may not end up happening, but the learning and the journey along the way is equally as valuable, and you will have started your building your own little network.
I really want to stress that you can find your allies everywhere. No one is the enemy in this situation. You can find some of your best mentors and allies among people who look nothing like you, who don't have the same religion as you, who are not from the same community as you. And to that end, I think there's an opportunity to have a really honest conversation about what women are doing to pull other women up and some of the things that they've done to pull women down because of the perception that there's only room for one of us at the table. And it's funny because I was having a conversation with someone the other day who's a senior manager in government, and she was saying about how she worked really hard to get to where she is. And so when someone comes along and she perceives that they've somehow skipped a couple of steps, she becomes resentful. And she was very honest about this, and I've certainly felt like I was on the receiving end of these kinds of biases, and sometimes they can be really unconscious. So, I think we can also be watchful for those biases in ourselves. If we find ourselves maybe comparing ourselves to someone else that we could lend a hand to and not being as helpful as we can. But I want to go back to my earlier point on negotiation. I think a lot of people think negotiation has to be adversarial or it has to be a confrontation. I mean, it doesn't have to be. I mean, it's basically a conversation between two people. It can be a win-win situation. And a really good way for baby steps for negotiation, which makes a wonderful assertiveness training platform. I mean, it's not just about money and benefits and salary. is next time a friend says, hey, do you want to go for pizza next Friday night? You don't have to say, yeah, sure, okay, whatever. You can say, actually, there's a great sushi restaurant that opened up last Friday night. Let's go check that out. Or actually, I feel more like pasta. And the point is not whether you prefer pasta over sushi or pizza. The point is that you're training yourself and other people around you that your needs and your wants matter, and they need to be part of the decision-making process. So I think those little baby steps that you can take, if the idea of having a negotiation with someone is too intimidating, I think that would be really useful for most people.
And I think it's also such an important sentiment that there's room for more than just one of us at the table, and that, it's great. It should be great that we're paving the way for women behind us to continue growing. I'm wondering, with perfect hindsight, is there anything that you might have done differently over the course of your careers?
For me, I would have found my voice sooner. It took me a while to get there, and I was very fortunate in that along the way I had some really great mentors along the way, some of whom are in this room, and that did eventually help me find my voice. But in the earlier part of my career, I just didn't have the confidence, and so it just took me a while to get there. So I guess what I can say to you is, find your voice. Don't be afraid to express your ideas. There is no such thing as a bad idea. If you're passionate about it, share it. Talk to someone about it. And like you were saying, Barbara, it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody in the business. Every exchange that we have is storytelling. We live in a world that's all about telling stories now because of the way technology is. And so we're all storytellers. So don't be afraid. Don't take as long as I took. Find your voice, share your stories.
Thank you, Hoda.
I feel like I'm at a point in my life and my career where I'm able to stand up for myself and say no to nonsense precisely because it's taken me so long to get here. I think a lot of that is life experience and the range of situations that you're exposed to. But if I could do anything really tangible in hindsight differently, I certainly would have taken more courses on financial literacy. I would have brushed up more on my technical skills because I definitely think that's always in demand. You can't have too much of that knowledge. But I'm pretty satisfied with my career and where I'm at today. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Hoda, is because I really love what I do. I'm really passionate about what I do, and I find value in what I can bring to the table every single day.
I'll just add one thing. We have had a very great tradition of mentoring young people in our company, and it's always been fantastic. Again, a couple of them are here in this room. I take heart from the fact that particularly the women, but also the men that we've mentored, who are probably millennials, I would say, seem to already have their voice. They have a good sense of who they are. They're very self-aware. They know what they know, at least better than I did, I think, at their age, who they are and what they want and what they're interested in. And they're not afraid of change. And so they may pivot, they may pirouette, and they're perfectly okay with that. So I take a lot of heart from that, from the things that I'm learning from the interns that we've had, because they're not just learning from us, but we're learning from them.
In terms of finding your voice and also finding these projects that you find meaning and value in, was there a point in your career when you were like, oh yeah, I've hit my stride and I've really I've come into myself and I found my voice? Was there a moment or a project where you felt that?
Well, it certainly wasn't with my first television show, which was a 2-hour special for the History Channel, shot out west. It was a period piece, it was a docudrama, and I was so lost. But you put on a good face and you move forward, and in some ways you pretend you know what you're doing, and other ways you're learning along the way. I think I found my stride when we did our first children's series, actually. It was the first one, and I really felt I hit a chord that resonated with me. And since then, we've done multiple kids shows, and of course the documentaries that I've worked on in the last couple of years. I also feel I hit my stride, but I think it was that first kids show. Yeah.
I think for me, finding my voice has really been rooted in giving other people the confidence to express their voices and building that trust. having hosted and produced Ottawa Experts for 4 years now, because it's community television, we bring in guests from a range of walks of life and media relations training. So some of the people who are coming into the studio have never been in front of a camera before, and they could be the most articulate people in the world when we chat preemptively, but then as soon as the cameras shine on them, they sort of freeze. And I actually find that aspect of my work really rewarding, where I can show people that it actually doesn't have to be intimidating, and you do have a right to tell your story, and you do have an interesting story worth telling, and you can come join me here on television and be immortalized and tell it, and it doesn't have to be for this sort of specific elitist group of people. So, and again, as a journalist, I mean, you're not, although of course there are always subconscious biases, you're not really supposed to have a voice, but you can look for a range of voices to be represented in your work to make sure that everyone that needs to tell their side of the story is telling it, that whatever story you come away with is fair and balanced. And that's where I have found my strength. Because as I mentioned earlier, having grown up, I always felt like a little bit of an outsider, and I feel like that's a strong point. That's a strong point in telling a story that is reflective of everyone else in the room.
Of course, I'm sure your past experiences have affect what stories you tell, and also how you navigate your professional life. My last question is two-part. First, I'm wondering where you draw inspiration from. I know for myself, I draw inspiration from documentaries like Knock Down the House, which are stories about women told by women. And my second part of my question is, if there's one thing that makes you hopeful about greater representation in the future of women in film.
That's a very big question. Really, I think I draw inspiration from the people that I work with, and from the stories that I read, and particularly if I'm reading something that inspires me, whether it's a book or a news article or a radio story, that's where I draw my inspiration. And that's often where the germs of an idea will start for me. What is the thing that makes me hopeful about the future of women in this industry? Well, yes, there are some programs in place, as I've mentioned, but you are what make me hopeful. You're here, and I'm, I have the joy of discovering and meeting some of you, and hopefully I'll get a chance to meet more of you. But I think this is what makes us hopeful. And you're here, and I think you probably all have stories that you want to tell, and hopefully you're not going to be afraid to tell them, and you're going to take some risks. So that's what makes me hopeful.
Thank you, Hoda.
I would say I'm most inspired in my work by the stories of resilience and continuity of other people who have escaped or transcended difficult circumstances to get to where they are today. I have tremendous respect for people like that, and when I try and seek those sources out to feature them, whether it's for an article or on my show or in a documentary, I really try to draw more out of them that they may have hesitated in saying, because they just didn't think it was an important or worthwhile part of the story. But it gives me tremendous satisfaction when I can give them that comfort and that confidence. The thing that gives me hope, I would say, is the democratization of media that has occurred. I mean, not to sound like a really old person, but when I started my career 20 years ago, the internet was only available on 2 computers in the back of the newsroom in the library. You had to walk to the internet. I mean, think about that for a second. You had to walk to the internet. And now everything is at our fingertips. Anyone can be a storyteller. Anyone can be a story maker. It's all out there for you, and I think that's wonderful.
Thank you both so much for your contributions today and for sitting down and chat with me. That was my chat with Barbara Balfour and Hoda Elatawi. I hope you enjoyed it. A huge shout out to our 2020 festival partner, Saw Video, for sponsoring the series. For more information about the festival, visit digi60.org. We'd like to keep the conversation going. Engage with us on Facebook at Digi60 Filmmakers Festival, on Twitter at Digi60Fest, and on Instagram at Digi.60, and let us know what you would like to learn about next. I'm Samphe, and I'll chat with you soon.